Good evening, students. Welcome to Srimeda IS Academy. Today, we'll have a talk about one process which has been a matter of very serious deliberations and discussions in recent times, particularly in the strategic circles, among statesmen, among academia. That is the process of deglobalization. Whether the world is witnessing the process of deglobalization or whether the process of globalization is still getting more and more integrationist is what we'll try to understand as a part of today's video. Now, you know that the world had witnessed the process of globalization not in recent times, from times immemorial. Even during the ancient period, we know that there was trade across continents. We spoke about the ancient Silk Route, which had become a major source of trade route in the ancient times, through which not only goods, but travelers, ideas, and institutions also, they were transported from one part of the world to another part of the world. Particularly ideas related to science or theology or political systems or strategic ideas, all of them, they've traveled from one part of the world to another part of the world to the ancient Silk Route. In the medieval period also, we had seen interaction between the countries across continents. In the modern times, after the birth of the modern nation state, we also had seen the process of globalization actually gaining a lot of momentum. There was integration of the world, there was trade, there were exchange of ideas, there were exchange of cultural traits. For example, India was the cultural heartland for a good number of countries in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, as well as in Far East. All this can be considered as globalization. Transportation of ideas, transportation of people, travelers, trade activities. Now all these are considered to be part of globalization. So there was globalization. So globalization is not something which is exclusive to the modern age. It was a trend that can be witnessed even during the ancient times as well. However, in the modern times, the process of globalization became more orderly. There is a discerning pattern in the way the process of globalization had taken shape in the modern times. Now, you know that in the modern times, globalization can be seen as integration of the world through trends like colonization. A good number of countries across various continents were colonized by the more dominant European powers. The entire Latin America, North America, the entire Asian continent, the entire African continent, even small islands like Fiji, Sri Lanka, all these islands also, they were colonized. So we had seen integration of the world, but that integration of the world was based on territorial aggrandizement, expansionist and imperialist policies of the European powers, who only wanted to colonize the world so that the world could be their periphery to sustain the industrial revolution in the European countries. After the end of colonization, that is in the post-war period, after the Second World War, we had seen global integration in a different form. We had seen several structures of governance taking their birth, like the Bretton Woods twins, the IMF, World Bank. We had seen agreements that took place in the liberal Western countries, like General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Through all these, integration of the world had taken place, particularly for trade in goods, merchandise. So countries tried to eliminate all barriers to trade, and thus a relationship was established, a trade relationship was established. So even after the Second World War also, though we had seen the world working up into two power blocks, the Eastern Bloc headed by Soviet Union, the Western Bloc headed by US, the two power blocks which are ideologically different from each other had actually divided the world into two, but still within the Western countries, within the liberal countries, there was integration. This also was considered to be a part of globalization. This process of globalization had gained momentum after the end of the Cold War. In the post-Cold War period, we had seen the process of globalization hastened, quickened. Neoliberalism as an ideology became very dominant, and this neoliberal ideology powered the process of globalization. A good number of international organizations like IMF and World Trade Organizations and the World Bank, all these institutions, they began to further the process of globalization. So much so that at one point of time, the process of globalization was considered to be almost an irreversible and an irresistible process. You must have heard about that very famous acronym called TINA, popularized by the former Prime Minister of England, Margaret Thatcher. She declared there is no alternative to the process of globalization. That was the trend. And world suddenly had entered into a phase of integration in an unprecedented scale. In an unprecedented manner, never before known in history, the world had integrated. The integration of the world was multi-layered. It was economic, social, political, cultural. In many ways, the world had integrated. Global structures of governance were created. And norms and traditions were established. Rules and regulations were created. So we had a more or less rule-based international order which propounded the idea of globalization and integration. That was the phase that was called as the phase of hyper-globalism, where probably the globalization had picked up momentum as never before seen in history. This was called the phase of hyper-globalism. And we had seen that phase throughout the entire decade of 1990s, when more and more countries got onto the bandwagon, became a part and parcel of this process of globalization. However, in recent times, there has been a talk about what is called as de-globalization. It is said that slowly the process of integration had actually slowed down. Okay? And countries are today showing more and more trends of adopting exclusive policies driven by sometimes their national interest, sometimes because of the rightist and nationalist policies of the government, and sometimes because of populist policies of the government. So a series of reasons can be attributed as to why in recent times we had seen the process of de-globalization. It is in this context that we'll try and understand what do we really mean by de-globalization, and whether this claim that the process of globalization had temporarily halted or slowed down is true or not. And if so, what are the manifestations of this process of de-globalization? Okay, so it is this area that is today very much a matter of deliberation among the academic circles is what we'll be discussing. And please remember that this topic that we're discussing today is very important for students who are aspiring for civil services. This is important for General Studies Paper 2 as a part of international relations. As also, this is very important for those students who are taking up examination with political science and international relations as their optional. Without understanding the trend of globalization, without understanding what it actually means, and without understanding whether this claim of deglobalization is true or not, you cannot really understand the nature of the present international system. So we'll go ahead and we'll try and see if this, the process of globalization actually, according to a good number of strategic experts, had integrated the world, created a global network of relations. But that world is slowly being shattered. We are seeing, according to a good number of experts, a retreat of globalization. So the process of globalization is now on the retreat. Okay? The world is now slowly developing fractures because the countries are now trying to build walls instead of bridges in securing international cooperation, coordination of policies, and integration of economies. Countries are now trying to build walls instead of bridges. And that's the reason why a good number of experts feel that today we are witnessing a retreat of globalization. Now, how do we really understand the meaning of deglobalization? According to World Economic Forum, deglobalization refers to the retreat from global economic integration. It is a retreat from global economic integration marked by rise of trade barriers, Reshoring of supply chains. Please remember, reshoring. Globalization promotes, supports, as well as instigates offshoring. Okay, so countries used to offshore their production process, their investments, but those are now being brought back into their country. That's called as a reshoring. Okay, the reshoring of supply chains, decline in cross-border trade, investments, and mobility. Okay, so this is how the World Economic Forum had tried to define the process of deglobalization. So, deglobalization refers to the retreat from global economic integration, marked by rise of trade barriers. We see tariff wars going on between countries, isn't it? The reshoring of supply chains, decline in cross-border trade, investments, and mobility. Okay, and please remember, it is popularly understood that this decline of the process of globalization, or what is today very famously called as deglobalization, is a trend that could be observed from 2014 onwards. Now, what exactly is the process of deglobalization? How does it take place? Okay, so the basically deglobalization refers to diminishing economic and political integration. Okay, earlier the countries were more and more interested in integrating their economies, integrating their policies, removing trade barriers, trying to create conditions of mutual interdependence. Now, that was how it was earlier. Okay, but now the process of economic and political integration is diminishing, it is reducing. Okay, we are also seeing reduction in international trade, investments, and cooperation. And thirdly, we are also witnessing the undermining of global structures of governance. Now, please remember that the process of globalization had created some structures of global governance. For example, we have the World Trade Organization, which is based on certain rules. For example, rules like the most favored nation status, rules like national treatment. Okay, so there were certain rules to which every member of the World Trade Organization will have to adhere. Okay, so the process of globalization, it implicitly, it contains certain rules for which every sovereign nation state has given its acceptance or consent. But those global structures of governance are now being undermined because countries, instead of adopting multilateralism, are beginning to take unilateral measures. Now, please remember that globalization is a process which is dependent on what's called as multilateralism, where all the countries will agree collectively to certain rules and regulations. So, in place of multilateralism, which is considered to be the very crux of the process of globalization, countries have resorted to unilateral measures, undermining the process of globalization. Okay, so the process of globalization is actually diminishing economic and political integration, reduction in international trade, investments, and cooperation, as well as undermining global structures of governance. Now, these are the three important aspects that we should understand as far as the process of deglobalization is concerned. Further, what are the various manifestations? What are the various manifestations of deglobalization is what we'll see. But before that, let us try and understand how the trend of globalization was. The trend of globalization as can be witnessed in the modern times. Now, please remember, the rise of globalization, particularly in the modern times, after the birth of the modern nation state, was never smooth or was never issued. Okay, now please remember, globalization requires all the countries to adopt multilateralism as a principle. So, countries should set aside their narrow national interests and they should try and agree upon certain principles based on which integration can occur. That's globalization. But that idea where countries will have to adopt multilateral measures and perspective to agree upon some principles had actually not taken place in a very smooth manner, because countries had given primacy to their national interests. Okay. Now you know that though the countries wanted to further trade, further cooperation, because the countries were giving primacy to their national interests, what was happening was that it was leading to trade wars and conflict, misunderstandings, and narrow interpretation of interests. All this began to take place, which ultimately led to conflicts. And of course, we had the world wars. Okay, so the process of globalization was hampered because of world wars, right? The First World War, Second World War, where each country was giving primacy to its national interest. Obviously, when every country begins to give primacy to its national interest, it is not going to be open to the idea of globalization, isn't it? Because globalization as a process is multilateral, it involves give and take. It involves countries to sacrifice to reap the benefits of an integrated global system. But countries were not ready for that sacrifice, and therefore, this narrow approach and giving primacy to their national interests always affected the process of globalization. It ultimately, as I told you, resulted in two wars of a world scale. Okay, and of course, after the Second World War, we had seen a phase of increased globalization. Okay, so globalization began to gather momentum after the Second World War. Particularly, as I told you, if you remember, that there were new structures that were created, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. These were certain mechanisms that were put in place so that the trade between countries occurs more smoothly, at least as far as the liberal Western countries were concerned. So the world began to integrate based on certain rules and regulations, certain agreements, okay, and that led to increased process of globalization in 60 years after the Second World War. Okay, and please remember that from 1990 onwards, there is another phase of globalization which is usually called as the phase of hyper-globalism. The phase of hyper-globalism or hyper-globalization. Now, this was the phase in which globalization peaked. Okay, and there was almost near unanimity among all the countries that they should try and take advantage of the process of globalization. Okay, WTO had near universal membership, and WTO became the main institutional mechanism through which countries integrated their economies. And we had seen the production process, the distribution being globalized really. So a multinational corporation based in some country in the West had its unit located in another country. It accessed raw materials from another country. It had back-end support for all its official work in another country. Okay, now this was the process of, globalization, where one multinational corporation creating subsidiaries and creating units, having franchises, having representatives, decentralizing its production process, accessing resources, creating markets. The process of globalization was in full swing throughout 1990, till almost the end of 2010. However, from 2008 to 2015, it was said that it was a phase of slowbalisation, where the process of globalization began to slow down. Okay, countries were not as enthusiastic as they were in the earlier period to integrate their economies. There was little hesitancy. Small seeds of suspicion began to be sowed. And a good number of countries, particularly those countries which could not reap benefits of the process of globalization, began to suspect this process, as whether this process was going to really support their intentions to realize economic development or not. Okay, that phase was called as the phase of slowbalisation. And from 2015 to the present times is usually described as the phase of de-globalization, where integration had become not slowed down, but integration had actually become reversed. Okay, so countries began to disengage from the process of globalization. Countries began to look at things from their nationalist perspective rather than from a global perspective. So national interest began to be given primacy again. Of course, the countries always give primacy to national interests. There is no doubt about that. But apart from giving primacy to national interests, countries also developed a mindset that they can service their national interests through integration. But now, countries began to think that they might not be able to efficiently serve their national interest through globalization. Okay, so primacy was given earlier also to national interest, but countries viewed globalization as a process which could help them realize their national objectives and interests. But now, countries began to feel that the process of globalization is going to actually hamper their national interests, their realization of national objectives. That's how countries began to view the process of deglobalization. Okay, and therefore, from 2015 to the present times is usually considered as the phase of deglobalization. The phase of deglobalization.